Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and pleased to have with me as my guest Tim Best, who's a partner at Gibson Dunn. Tim, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate the gracious invitation.
Well, Tim, I'm always excited to interview a fellow Caltech alumni lawyer, and that's one of the reasons I invited you. You have a PhD from Caltech, so I can't wait to dive right in. But why don't you start by telling me why you chose, it looks like chemistry was your major, why you chose that as a field of study in the first place?
So I grew up in a small town in Indiana, which maybe didn't have a lot of great things to recommend academically, but it had some great science teachers, one of
Oh,
whom was my chemistry teacher.
huh.
And he was really interesting fellow, interesting in the sense that he sort of grew up in the 60s and never left them, but he knew chemistry, loved to teach it, and I picked that up and really grew to love it. And so when I was looking for things to do, it really was high on my list.
Interesting. And you just, I mean, you like the subject. Chemistry for a lot of people is very esoteric and hard to comprehend, but you just really love the subject.
I do. To be clear, I focused more on bioorganic chemistry, which is just a fancy way of saying half the time I spent my time uh, doing what chemists are sort of seems like they would do in the lab coat and beakers and flasks and smelly chemicals, making molecules. And then the other half of the time taking those molecules and seeing what they did.
Hmm. Well, what kind of career were you thinking about at the time you went into chemistry, or were you thinking about a career goal at that point?
I more or less thought I would end up as a patent attorney.
Oh, really?
Candidly, I didn't know what that really meant. I knew that it meant something sort of sciency and inventor related, and I knew that it was law, and those were both attractions to me.
Huh.
As I
Where did the
Okay.
notion of patent attorney even come in? How did that get into your mind?
I think I read something about what patent attorneys do when I was in my like high school counselor's office trying to figure out, okay,
Oh,
here are the things you could potentially do. This was one of those things. I wouldn't have known it otherwise. There were no lawyers in my family. We didn't know any lawyers. So it
yeah.
was a green field, so to speak.
Oh, interesting. So you went into college with this goal kind of in the back of your mind to be a patent attorney, but then you still went and got your PhD. Why not just go to law school after you get your undergrad degree?
Well, candidly, that was my goal. When I went into undergrad, I figured 4 years, go to law school, start working.
Uh-huh.
Then, sort of 2 years in, 3 years in, I started to do some undergraduate research. I found I liked it. And
Oh,
I also had the opportunity to talk with some people who were patent attorneys. And
uh-huh.
they said, well, yeah, a lot of people do what you're thinking of doing, but a lot of people also go to graduate school. And so between that and doing some research and figuring out I enjoyed it, and I figured, okay, well, I'll try this. And if I'm not really digging it, I can take a master's and leave at a relatively early time, but I stuck with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a PhD is no small commitment. What was your thesis on?
The lab that I was in made these molecules that bind to DNA, sequence specifically and with high affinity.
Hmm.
And so that had all sort of been worked out, the how you design the molecule to bind a particular sequence before I joined.
Hmm.
But the where I joined, we were just starting to get into, okay, can we apply these? Can we actually do anything with them biologically?
Hmm.
And the first step there is to figure out, okay, do they get into cells? If they get
Hmm.
into cells, where do they go? What happens to them? So I spent a lot of my PhD time basically making fluorescent molecules, fluorescent versions of these molecules, and throwing them onto plates of cells and using microscopy to sort of see where those molecules trafficked.
Hmm. What did you conclude from that? Or what?
That, depending on the structure, some of the molecules would not get into cells. And so
Hmm.
by basically making hundreds of these molecules, we sort of figured out structural characteristics that favored incorporation into cells and disfavored. And so working from that paradigm, we could move forward to making, only the chemicals that are actually going to work.
Hmm. Is your research being used in any commercial way today?
I think not at present. So my part was cells. The next
Yeah.
step is animals, and that was what sort of started happening after I left. Um, Most recently, my PI retired, so I don't know if anyone's even picking up that research going forward. But um, it was interesting to me, and it was
Yeah.
great because it really was this um, interface between chemistry and biology, where I had to learn a lot about both, which has helped me as a lawyer.
Yeah, interesting. Well, did you ever waver from your law goal, or did you ever think during that, hey, maybe I'll just stay on the science track or not?
Yeah, I did. I think, like a lot of people, I considered going the postdoc route, the
Mm.
sort of academic route. My advisor, I will say, my advisor was really supportive of whatever decision I made, including going to law school.
Oh,
A
wow.
lot of advisors, they view having grad students as, if you're not going to go into academics or maybe industry, but mostly academics, then it's sort of a waste.
Yeah.
My advisor wasn't like that at all. He had started companies. He'd helped start Gilead. He was
Mm.
more savvy in
Mm.
that, and worldly in that sense. And
Mm.
so when I told him, up front, when I joined his lab, this was something I was considering, he was always supportive.
Oh,
That
wow.
having been said, of course, he wants more people in academics, if they can be. And so we talked about a postdoc, maybe in Europe, but ultimately I decided, yeah, I've been in school for long enough. Let's move along.
So when you got to law school, what did you think? Very different from obviously anything you'd done in the past. What did you like it right away? I mean, how was that like?
Well, I gave my dissertation on like August 8th, and 2 weeks later I was sitting in torts. So I would say it was a jarring experience. Um, Work-wise, candidly, it was a lot less work, at least in the first year, than I had to do for a while, which
Yeah.
was interesting. I can't say that I got a lot out of the first year sort of generalist curriculum, but as I got into later years where I could take uh, more classes that were more focused on interests of mine, for example, patent law, IP law, copyright, art law, and the like. That was far more interesting to me,
Yeah.
and really gave me more of a basis going forward to apply that information usefully.
Yeah. Now, most PhD scientists, as you probably know, they end up going to patent prosecution. Looks like you went to litigation. When did you kind of sort that out in your mind?
Well, as I said, when I went to law school, I knew patent lawyer, and I
Uh-huh.
knew nothing else. I didn't know there was this distinction
I see.
between a litigator, a prosecutor, and transactional, which
Yeah.
I hadn't even heard of.
Yeah.
I pretty quickly figured out that I didn't want to do prosecution because I was able to take a class, sort of a short class on patent prosecution,
Yeah.
writing a patent, writing claims. Wasn't for me. And then I did a summer associateship, and I learned what transactional work was, and the notion in a transactional practice is everyone's supposed to win a little bit.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
I really didn't want everyone to win. I wanted to win. So I thought litigation was pretty clearly the right direction.
Yeah.
And it clearly was the right direction.
Yeah.
I've been very happy with that choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, tell me a little about your litigation practice, and in particular, how do you get to use your science, or if you do at all?
So most IP lawyers, I think, would tell a similar story, but from my perspective as doing a PhD, being in academics, you become a world expert, maybe the world expert on this tiny little postage stamp of space.
Yeah.
But in law, every case is different, and
Yeah.
so you get to learn so much with each individual case. Things where you probably know the subject matter generally, you know what the important big issues are, but then you have to really dig deeply into material that you've not studied before. And I
Yeah.
do that constantly. So
Yeah.
even in cases in the life sciences, so pharmaceutical, biochemistry, biotech, a lot of biotech
Yeah.
cases,
Yeah.
monoclonal antibodies, that sort of thing. Uh, there are aspects of that that are new to me with every case, even
Yeah.
though you'd say, well, it's an antibody, is an antibody, is an antibody. Well, they really aren't. There are a lot of distinctions and interesting things to learn. So
Yeah.
that's great. But then there's when you have time, you sort of take on whatever comes over the transom. So recently I worked on a case about computer and network security,
Mm.
about which I knew nothing, right? I went into it. I had some interest, just personal interest in sort of computing theory, like uh, Turing incomputability and that sort of thing, and the actual physical um, making of microchips and that sort of thing, which is mostly chemistry. So it was a natural interest. So I had at least some background, but
Yeah.
I knew nothing about the software, and I learned a ton, and it was
Yeah.
great. I loved learning. Okay, this is what the kernel is. This is what the user space is. This is what the things are doing with each other. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, interesting. Because you had never taken any programming classes in your college or anything like that?
Yes and no. So I had never taken a software or a programming class. I did take in my senior year in college a class called digital electronics. Now, this class was taught by a man, brilliant guy, but who had been teaching since the 50s, and never did we get near an actual digital device. All of the devices were actually drawing circuit diagrams on paper on the board, figuring out, okay, this is what a flip-flop is, and you combine the flip-flops together to get gates, and you use the gates to make the logic, and the logic does the operations you want. And so I did learn, like, from like the ground level, literally from the blackboard, sort of how computers work, which was
Yeah.
interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in terms of software, I had no idea at all.
Yeah. Now, what made you decide to choose Caltech as a graduate school? I mean, it's a pretty small school. I assume you had a lot of different options. Did you have some connection with Caltech? Is that a place you always wanted to go to?
No, to be honest, it wasn't a place I'd even heard of going into college.
Oh, wow.
Um, as I neared the end of my career at Butler University, which is where I did my undergrad, I had to figure out, okay, if I'm going to grad school, where am I going to go? And
Yeah.
a lot of my options were that I thought were places I'd live were in the Middle West, where I was living and where I was from. But I also just looked at what were some of the top schools in chemistry, which is what I knew I was going to do. And one of them was this small school in Los Angeles. My
Huh.
view of Los Angeles was this completely conceptual place that was just like orange and smog,
Uh-huh.
which once I came out here proved completely incorrect.
Uh-huh.
And I think Caltech was particularly attractive because it was small.
Yeah.
I grew up in a small town. I went to a small college. This was a small place. And so it felt more comfortable and natural than someplace like Berkeley, where I also looked, and Colorado and Stanford. So I loved it in terms of the location and the people and the because it was small, the ease of overlapping interests sort of meeting each other and
Yeah.
fermenting and generating new ideas. I thought that was great, and it was the right decision.
Huh. So did you enjoy your time at Caltech? Or like, a lot of people think it's kind of a small school, there's not a gigantic campus. It can be kind of a little insular. What'd you think?
So I'd separate it in two pieces. Professionally, it was awesome.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was I can't imagine a better place
Huh.
to have world-class people coming in and giving lectures every afternoon at 4.
Oh, right.
And if they aren't so good, you can take a nap. But if they are good, like it's a great experience. So from that perspective, it was excellent. Socially, uh, Caltech is all scientists and engineers, which,
Yeah. Yeah.
as the Blues Brothers would have it, is like having both kinds of music, country and Western. So it's like that part was more of a challenge, I'll be honest. But I still managed to make a lot of close friends who are still friends, a
Yeah.
lot of whom stayed around here, which is not that common in academics, as I'm sure you sort of take a job where you can get it
Yeah.
usually, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that and a lot of people I know that was true of, but a lot of them stayed around. So
Yeah.
that was great, and has given me these long-term relationships that I really appreciate.
Yeah, yeah. Now, in your professional world, do any of your clients or experts that you work with, are they impressed with your PhD from Caltech, or do they ever notice it? Does that ever come up in any conversations?
It sometimes comes up, but only in conversations on cases where it's sort of roughly applicable.
I see. Yeah,
And honestly, I think more frequently with experts and potential experts,
yeah,
whenever I'm speaking with them, I think they are more willing um, well, let's just say more willing to give me the benefit of the doubt and to sort of speak to me as not an equal, because these guys are actual experts, literally usually have written the book on the topics, which
yeah,
I
literally.
certainly didn't do.
Yeah,
But I can converse with them, and they treat me well, and of course I treat them well because they're august. And I think that's a great experience.
yeah,
And what I would say is Caltech has opened a lot of doors that wouldn't have opened otherwise,
yeah,
and that has been excellent.
yeah. So it sounds like you're very pleased with your career decision. You're glad you chose chemistry. You're glad you did the PhD, and you're glad you went into law. Is that all a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's all fair. It's
Yeah,
not all I do, but it's all, I don't like everything I do every day,
yeah, of
but I
course.
like most of what I do most days. And
Yeah,
and it's hard to ask for more, I think.
yeah, yeah. Well, Tim, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time and sharing your story. I love to talk to Caltech alums that became lawyers, and you were no exception.
Yeah, same here. It's been a great time, and I really appreciate it. Good conversation.
This is Richard Hsu and Tim Best. Thanks.